For years he traveled the same streets under the same traffic lights, watching the same people get in and out of the back seat of his taxi. For most, he had no name. He was just the voice that said, "Good night," the man holding the wheel while others talked about their own lives. Some discussed expensive business. Others complained about traffic, the fare, the difficult day. Few looked him in the eye. Almost no one asked how he was. He learned early on that invisibility is also exhausting. Not because it is silent, but because it is constant. Every passenger who closed the door without saying thank you reinforced the same feeling. He was there, but he wasn't seen. No matter how hard he worked, how much he tried to be polite or helpful, to the world he was just part of the way, not someone who mattered. On an ordinary night near the end of his shift, a different passenger got into the car. Well-dressed, confident, talking on the phone as if the world were always ready to hear him. At one point he laughed and said something that seemed like a random comment, almost a joke. "Nowadays you just have to look rich to be treated with respect." The sentence was said without weight, but it hung in the air longer than it should have. After the passenger left, the taxi followed in silence. The traffic remained the same, as did the city. But inside him, something had changed. For the first time, he couldn't just forget a ride. That sentence began to repeat in his mind, insistent, uncomfortable, and without realizing it, he began to wonder if the problem was never who he was, but how the world chose to see him. This simple question would be the start of a night that would change everything. He tried to continue the night as he always did. He changed the radio station, adjusted the mirror, accepted another ride. But the phrase kept coming back like a bothersome echo that won't go silent. You just have to look rich. The more he drove, the more he remembered old situations, doors that didn't open, conversations that changed tone when they were told what he did for a living, gazes that lost interest as soon as they realized he was just a driver. When he got home in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion didn't bring sleep. He lay down, stared at the dark ceiling, and let his thoughts run free. He revisited moments when he was treated with indifference for no clear reason. There was no direct offense, no aggression, just the constant feeling of not being taken seriously, of existing, but not counting. That had always bothered him, but he had never stopped to truly analyze it. The idea came without fanfare, almost shyly. What if he tested this? Not out of ambition, nor revenge, just out of curiosity, just to understand. He didn't want to deceive anyone for long. He wanted to feel, even if just for a few hours, what it would be like to be treated differently, what it would be like to enter a place and be respected before even opening his mouth. At first, he himself thought the idea was absurd. Who was he trying to fool? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't about money, but about appearance, posture, external signs. Things he saw every day in the passengers who ignored him. The discomfort grew, mixed with a curiosity hard to contain. By dawn, he was still awake. He hadn't officially decided anything, but something was already clear. That idea wouldn't go away on its own. And deep down, he knew that ignoring it would mean continuing to live exactly the same way. Perhaps it was just an ordinary night, or maybe it was the only chance to discover a truth that had always been before him, but that he never had the courage to face. He didn't have extra money, nor important connections, much less a luxurious life to display. But he had something no one could take from him: years of silent observation. Driving through the city nights, he learned to notice details few perceive. How the rich dressed without exaggeration, how they spoke naturally, without haste, how they never seemed to ask permission to occupy space. That wasn't ostentation. It was security. That night, he decided to try. Not as a game, but as an experiment. He opened his wardrobe and chose the pieces carefully. A simple but well-fitted blazer, a neutral shirt, an old watch that looked more expensive than it really was. The shoes were clean, the hair was done. Nothing flashy, nothing too fake. He knew that exaggeration raised suspicions. Before leaving, he stood for a few seconds in front of the mirror. He didn't practice fancy lines or elaborate stories. What needed to change wasn't the speech, it was the posture. Straight shoulders, firm gaze, calm movements. He took a deep breath and noticed something strange. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel smaller than anyone else. Leaving the house, he was still the same man. Same age, same history, same insecurities. But something had adjusted inside. As he walked down the street, he noticed different looks. People who before would have passed straight by now observed for a second longer. It wasn't admiration. It was recognition. As if suddenly he belonged to that space. That made him uncomfortable, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Nothing in him had really changed. Just the packaging. And even so, the world reacted differently. He felt a tightness in his chest, realizing how simple that was. And at the same time, cruel. The night was still at the beginning, and he already understood that this experience would go beyond what he imagined. He wasn't just transforming himself. He was about to see the world without illusions. The first place he entered was simple, but frequented by people who always seemed sure of themselves. As soon as he walked through the door, something happened. There was no announcement, no introduction. Still, he felt it. The looks weren't curious. They were evaluative, a type of silent attention he had never received before. For the first time, no one asked what he did for a living right at the start. They only asked if he would like to sit down. He chose any seat and waited. In a few minutes, someone struck up a conversation. The tone was different from what he was used to. There was no condescension, no haste to end the dialogue. People listened. They agreed. They disagreed with respect. That disoriented him. He said the same things as always, had the same opinions, but now they seemed to have weight. An attendant approached with more attention than necessary, offered options, explained details, smiled. Nothing exaggerated, just consideration. He realized he wasn't being treated well for who he was, but for who he seemed to be. This realization caused a knot in his throat. It wasn't joy. It was a mix of surprise and discomfort. Throughout the conversation, no one asked for proof. No one questioned his story. His posture, confident silence, and lack of haste were enough. He began to understand something unsettling. In that environment, respect came before any truth. It didn't matter if it was real. It mattered if it looked real. As he observed the people around him, he noticed how they all behaved similarly. They spoke calmly, didn't over-justify themselves, didn't beg for attention. He recognized this behavior. It was the same as the passengers who ignored drivers, waiters, attendants. The difference now was cruel. He was on the other side. When he left that place, the street air seemed colder. The experiment had worked, and that scared him. Because if all that was so easy to provoke, then the problem was never in him. The night hadn't ended yet. But he already knew that what would come next would be even more revealing. It was in another setting more crowded that he noticed the clearest change. As soon as he arrived, he didn't have to wait. Someone made space. A greeting came with a smile. For the first time, he felt that his presence was desired, not tolerated. And this happened without him saying a single word. It was enough to be there, in the right way, at the right time. Conversations flowed naturally. The questions were different. They wanted to know what he thought, what he liked, where he usually went. No one asked how much he earned, but everyone assumed he earned well. It was a comfortable assumption for them. And curiously, comfortable for him too at that moment. Not because it was true, but because it freed him from the constant need to explain himself. That's when he realized something he had never experienced before. People listened to him without interrupting. They laughed at the right time. They reacted to his words as if they were relevant. That affected him in an unexpected way. It wasn't vanity. It was a realization. He always had a voice. The world just chose when to listen to it. At a certain point, he noticed different looks. Not of curiosity, but of interest. People approached not to fill time, but to be there. This made him restless. For years, he went unnoticed even when he tried. Now he just had to exist in that way to be noticed. The injustice of that logic hit him hard. As the night progressed, it became clearer that it wasn't about charm or charisma. It was presumed status. It was the automatic reflection of signs society has learned to respect. He hadn't become better. He just seemed more important. And that was enough. When he stepped away for a few minutes, he observed the scene from a distance. The same people, the same behaviors, the same dynamics as always. The only variable was him. For the first time, he felt the weight of a truth hard to swallow. If that treatment depended only on appearance, how many people lived invisibly without ever having a choice? The answer began to bother him deeply. Amidst the conversations, a specific situation caught his attention. Someone commented, in a casual tone, about money, power, and how some people don't try hard enough to win. He had heard that discourse before countless times, but never from that side of the table. The curious thing is that now no one included him among the failures. On the contrary, they spoke as if he were above it, as if he were someone who had understood the game. He listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. He just observed how the words were said without care, without empathy, as universal truths. That hit him harder than any explicit contempt. Because now he realized those opinions were only comfortable because they didn't apply to him at that moment. If they knew who he really was, the tone would be different. At one point, someone asked what he did. The question came without suspicion, without malice, just curiosity. He answered vaguely, without lying directly. He spoke of work, routine, experiences. No one asked for details. No one demanded proof. The answer was accepted immediately. The respect remained intact. That made him restless. For years, he needed to justify every choice, every delay, every limitation. Now, superficiality was enough. He realized that the truth didn't have as much weight as he imagined. What mattered was the version people created in their heads, and that version was shaped in seconds. The conversation continued, but he was no longer fully present. Something had changed inside him. The experiment, which began as curiosity, was now becoming uncomfortable. He didn't feel like a winner. He felt exposed to a cruel reality. It wasn't that the world was unfair just to him. It was unfair by default. When he stepped away again, he felt like leaving. Not out of fear of being discovered, but because he had seen enough. The night was showing him something he could never unsee. And at that moment he realized that the experience was far from over. The real impact was yet to come. Upon leaving the place, he walked a few blocks without a definite direction. The city remained alive, noisy, indifferent. People passed by in a hurry. Others laughed at open tables, and no one had any idea of the turmoil happening inside him. The experiment was working too well, and the more it worked, the heavier it became. He realized he wasn't playing a character. He was just allowing others to create a version of him, and that version received everything the real man never had. Immediate respect, effortless attention, automatic consideration. That didn't bring joy. It brought a void hard to explain. At one point he remembered how many times he entered similar places wearing his work uniform. How the treatment was different. How gazes slid over him as if he were part of the furniture. The memory tightened his chest. Nothing in him had really changed since then. Only the context. The mask began to tire. Not because it required effort, but because it revealed too much. He could no longer ignore the contrast between that night and his daily life. The false version of him received everything. The real one needed to prove everything. This comparison was unbearable. For the first time, he felt anger. Not at specific people, but at the invisible system that decided who deserved respect even before any action. A silent, automatic system, accepted by everyone, including him, for a long time, without realizing it. He stopped in front of a shop window and observed his own reflection. The clothes, the posture, the expression. He was the same man. Still, he seemed like another. And it was in that instant that he understood something painful. If he continued in that role, he might even gain attention, opportunities, and comfort. but he would lose something more valuable: a clear conscience. The night was coming to an end, but the experiment was not. He needed to conclude that in the right way, not for others, for himself. And without knowing it, he was about to cause the situation that would make it impossible to ignore everything he had learned up to that point. He returned to the place where he had left the car parked, feeling the weight of the decision that was maturing in silence. There were still people around, cross conversations, loose laughter, and unspoken expectations. For everyone there, the night still promised excesses. For him, it promised truth. For the first time, he seriously thought about ending the game. As he walked, he was approached again. Questions arose, invitations were made, and he realized how just one word was enough to keep the fantasy intact. No one questioned. No one asked for proof. Presumed money spoke louder than any real biography. That bothered him deeply. He agreed to sit for a few more minutes. He wanted to see how far it would go. The conversations became more intimate, more interested, more calculated. And the more they progressed, the clearer it became. It wasn't about who he was, but about what he represented. A possibility, a shortcut, a temporary benefit. At one point, someone asked something simple, almost innocent: where exactly he worked. The question hung in the air. He just had to lie once more. He just had to invent a position, a company, some title. He felt the response rise, automatic. But something stopped him. The silence was short, yet revealing. Gazes met, curious, attentive. He took a deep breath. That was the point of no return. If he continued, he would step onto ground he wouldn't leave unscathed. If he stopped, everything could collapse right there. He then answered vaguely, diverting. The conversation continued, but something had changed. The atmosphere was no longer so light. For the first time that night, he felt the character starting to crack. And strangely, that brought relief. In that instant, he understood that he didn't need to expose everything to prove what he had learned. It was enough to acknowledge it internally. The experience had fulfilled its role. The truth was now too clear to be ignored, and the end of that night was closer than anyone imagined. He decided to leave before the night officially ended. There was no announcement, no long goodbyes. He just stood up, thanked them politely, and walked away while he could still leave without explanations. No one tried to stop him. Interest diminished in the same proportion as the promise of advantage disappeared. That confirmed everything. Inside the car, now alone, the silence seemed more honest than any conversation from those previous hours. He started the engine and sat still for a few seconds, looking at the worn steering wheel he knew so well. That was his real place, not the illuminated hall, nor the tables full of others' expectations. There no one pretended anything. As he drove through the nearly empty streets, he began to replay every detail of the night. The changing looks, the differentiated treatment, the exaggerated attention. None of this had anything to do with charisma, intelligence, or kindness. Everything revolved around a simple idea. Access, money, even non-existent, had been enough to completely transform the way he was seen. He didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. An uncomfortable but necessary clarity. He realized how many times throughout his life he had been invisible, not because of who he was, but because of what he didn't appear to have. That night just laid bare something that had always been there. Parking in front of his own house, he took a deep breath. The farce was over, but the lesson would stay. He understood that bought respect is not respect, conditioned interest is not affection, and status-based attention disappears as quickly as it arises. Before getting out of the car, he looked at his own hands again. They were the same as always. No wealth had emerged. No real power had been acquired. Still, he felt different. Not bigger, more lucid. That night didn't give him advantages, contacts, or stories to brag about. It gave something rarer, the certainty that he would never confuse value with appearance again, and that he knew would change the way he viewed the world from then on. The next day, everything looked the same on the outside. The same alarm clock, the same simple coffee, the same car waiting in the street. But something inside him had changed permanently. He didn't wake up feeling cheated or regretful. The experience was not a mistake. It was a mirror. As he drove and watched people enter the taxi without even noticing him, he understood that indifference no longer hurt as before. Now it made sense. The previous night had shown how attention can be artificial, fragile, and interested. And curiously, that brought relief. He spent the day working as always, but with a different outlook. Every conversation, every silence, every automatic gesture gained a new meaning. There was no longer a need to imagine what it would be like to be treated differently. He already knew. And he also knew the price of it. At some point he thought about telling the story, but he gave up. That experience wasn't about proving something to others. It was about understanding something in himself. He didn't need to expose anyone. The truth had already served its purpose. That night, parking the car and turning off the engine, he smiled discreetly. Not out of pride nor revenge, but out of freedom. He knew exactly who he was, and that was enough. He didn't need borrowed labels or manufactured attention. Some people spend their whole lives trying to look like something to be accepted. He spent only one night pretending, and learned enough to never need it again. Because in the end, whoever only sees you for what you appear to have will never see who you really are. And that was the greatest wealth he took from that night. Some stories don't exist to impress. They exist to reveal. What he lived through that night was not about money, status, or appearance. It was about realizing how the world changes when you seem to have something, and how it goes back to being cold when that disappears. Maybe this story reminded you of moments when you were ignored, underestimated, or treated as invisible. Maybe it showed that not all attention is real, and that not all silence is failure. In the end, he went back to the same life. But he went back different, more aware, freer, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Because when you understand who you are, the opinion of those who only value appearance completely loses its power. If this story touched you in some way, subscribe to the channel to keep following real stories that show truths few have the courage to tell. Like the video, it helps the channel reach more people who need to hear messages like this. And share it with someone who has been treated differently for not appearing to have anything. Sometimes all a person needs is to realize they are not alone. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.